20 minutes. I'll try at least. Many of the people in the audience have had the misfortune of having to listen. Don't laugh. I've had the opportunity of perhaps the misfortune to listen to me for a long time. And I suspect many of you haven't had an opportunity or whatever to listen to some kind of research I've been doing. Our dean talked about our institution and the importance of full-time faculty. And one of the things that this institution does very well is it develops its people. And I was privileged last year to take a sabbatical and go away and do some thinking and some research. And it was a fantastic opportunity, and I wouldn't have got it without having been a full-time faculty member. So from the faculty side, we're also very privileged to be part of this community. And one of the research projects I worked on is, I'm going to present some of our results for our research project. The title is a typically academic title, with words that most of you are not interested in or not heard of before. So I will try to kind of use normal language when I explain it. If at any point during the presentation you've got questions, just don't hesitate to raise your hand. I've also got some more technical slides as well, which I haven't included in the main presentation. But if you do have a question about the statistical analysis we did, I'm more than happy to take those questions as well. Okay? So I'll say a few words about what the research question that we were looking at in a moment. I'll then talk about the background to it, and that's a little bit esoteric. One of the things that we have to do as faculty members is not just sort of engage with practice, but also engage with our colleagues. And a lot of the work that we do, intellectually speaking, can sometimes be quite, I don't use the word high level because it makes it sound like it's really important, but it's certainly esoteric. And I'll try and keep it sort of grounded as I can. Then I'll say a few words about the study itself and the method that we used, and I'll give you some headline results. And then I'll give you some thoughts and implications about the research. But as I say, if during the presentation you want to get some sort of flavour of how we actually, a bit of granularity on the research itself, we can do that. So here were the two research questions. I was doing this research with colleagues in Italy, and I'm sure as many of you know, the Italian economy is driven by small companies. If you think about the most successful firms in Italy, they're not large corporations. In fact, I'm sure you can think of large Italian corporations which are highly unsuccessful ones, right? So the true secret of the Italian economy is this small, medium-sized sector in basically four sectors: food, fashion, furniture, and mechanical. So these sectors of the Italian economy are what drives the wealth, in particular in the northern part of the country. So if you think about Italy as a T with a boot at the end, you're looking at northwest, north central. So northwest is Torino, north central is Milano, northeast is Venice, and Trieste, right? So it's the top sector there. And that pretty much drives the economy. So I was fortunate enough during my sabbatical to have a fellowship at the University of Trieste, Budapest by the sea, as I call it. If you've ever been to Trieste, you know what I mean. It's like Budapest buildings, but you've got the seaside. It's kind of nice. Maybe we could all move there instead. And of course, in that part of Italy, understanding the needs of small businesses is crucial to the economic livelihood of the country. And one of the things that Italian firms have discovered in recent years is that many of their core markets, Western Europe, North America, have slowed down dramatically, made even worse, of course, by the economic crisis in 2008. And so like many entrepreneurs, Italian entrepreneurs like, where do we sell our products? And if you think about food, fashion, and furniture, the obvious places are fast-growing economies with a rapidly growing middle class, right? So of course it's the emerging markets, developing countries more broadly. So our core research question was, if I'm an Italian SME, can I take the strategies I've used to become successful in Western Europe and North America to China, India, Turkey, Russia, and so forth, right? Now the fancy academic speakers do the lack of development market regulatory institutions in developing countries, institutional voids, take a deep breath, impact the performance of SMEs selling in those countries. So to my academic audience, that's the question I ask. But to most ordinary people, it's how do Italian entrepreneurs adjust their business strategies to be successful in these countries where institutions that they take for granted, courts, intellectual property, contract enforcement, just simply don't exist, okay? And in particular, Italian SMEs are known basically for two things: design and hard work. And how do those capabilities and resources work in countries where hard work and design cannot be easily protected? Right. If you're an Italian furniture company making ridiculously overpriced kitchens, and you go to India or China, the chances are within 3 years of you setting up a showroom in that country, there will be a local Chinese or Indian entrepreneur that is trading under your name. Right? That's just an example. So for Italian entrepreneurs, they've got a real problem. How do they make this work? Now, in terms of this sort of the academic research, there's lots and lots and lots of research that fellow academics read, and I made some of my students read. Remember that paper on the Uppsala model that I showed some of you? There's lots of stuff on how do companies become international. So there's nothing new about that as a research stream. Increasingly, there's also lots of research done on developing countries and emerging markets. So yeah, nothing particularly interesting. In our game of academic research is we have to find a hook that's different. So this is sort of this quest for uniqueness. We can argue that whether it's worth doing it or not, but that's what we try and do. And there's an increasing focus on what we call the resource-based view of strategy. What is the resource-based view of strategy? It's the following. It's not about your market positioning that makes you successful. It's about the resources and capabilities that you as a company possess in your competitive battle with rivals. Duh. So obvious, but for academics, there's a time lag in terms of recognizing what goes on. The second aspect of the research is the so-called institutional view of strategy. So again, what these guys are saying is, a company just can't go into a market and expect a market to function in the way they're used to. What markets need are institutions. Right? So when institutions don't exist, institutional voids, what happens to your strategy? Right? So that's the academic piece. I've got that over there. So there's a lack, however, of studies looking at small businesses and how they internationalize, in particular in developing countries. But if you're an Italian producer of salami, selling your salami in Russia is crucial to your future. Right? The economies are not growing in Western Europe. We need to find places to sell our food or wine. If you're an Italian wine producer, the growth markets for wine are China, not France. Although the French wouldn't drink Italian wine because French wine costs the best. Or Britain. We don't produce very good wine in Britain. It's China. So again, if I'm an Italian wine producer, I control a hill and I produce a couple of 1,000 bottles a year. How the hell do I sell that stuff in China? I know there's a market for my product. Now, if you're a large company, Procter & Gamble, BMW or whatever, when you go to an emerging market, you don't have a problem because when you arrive, you're so big, you create institutions. Right? You arrive, you set up standards, you build infrastructure, you do all of the kinds of things which give you your advantage. Resources, money, know-how, technology. So what the large companies do in emerging markets are what we call internalized transactions, bypassing institutional voids. They set the standard that people follow. SMEs can't do that. So our research question was, even if you as a small company have all these resources and capabilities which are valuable in your core markets, what happens if you take those capabilities and resources to emerging markets? That was the research question. I got there. So here's the study itself. I don't know how familiar you are with empirical research using questionnaires, but a 10 to 15% return is pretty good. Right? That's a pretty good sample. We set out 750 questionnaires, and we got positive responses, which enabled us to do 200 interviews, which is pretty good. Fortunately, myself and my colleagues, we had some research funds where we could actually hire a market research company to do the actual calling for us. So So that also made it a lot easier. You can see the sectoral breakdown here: food, fashion, furniture, and mechanical. If you want, I can show you in more detail. I'll go right to the end here. I have a table which also tells you something about the companies themselves. You've got company size here. You can see the relatively small companies, you see. Not large numbers of employees, and you can see their revenues again, pretty small. Only 1% of our sample had revenues of about 50 million euros. So really, these are relatively small businesses. You can see 36% between 5 and 10 million euros. So this is the lifeblood of the Italian economy. These kinds of companies. Get all the way back up. Sorry, I didn't organize this too well. There we go. So our dependent variable, the dependent variable is the thing we're seeking to measure the change in, is what we call performance. Now, we deliberately did not choose financial performance. And we didn't choose financial performance as a measure for two reasons. First of all, private companies don't tell you that kind of information because they don't have to. And secondly, because of the sample that we had and the kinds of companies, we don't think that performance measured in financial terms is that relevant. So we use a perceptions-based approach of performance. So we asked the entrepreneurs in our sample, 3 years prior to this questionnaire, are you very satisfied, neither satisfied, Likert scale 1 to 5, about their performance. So we generated our dependent variable. And we considered 5 dimensions: sales volume, market share, profitability, sales growth, and the achievement of strategic objectives. So it's a fairly holistic measure. Right? So while it's not an actual number that we took from public sources, because we can't get that, we think we have a fairly robust measure. And the average of the 5 items was used to put it together. And it was not weighted out. So each of these indicators were equally weighted. Are you still with me so far? And then, of course, we had a whole bunch of what we call control and dummy variables, right? So a control variable is something that we include in our study, A, because it's been used before, and B, just to make sure that these control variables are not impacting the outcomes of our results. And here they are. We looked at firm size, age of the company, the number of countries in which the company has exporting activities. And I'll come back to why these are important later on. And we had these so-called industry dummies. So we had these 4 dummies: food, fashion, furniture, and mechanical. All right, that's the setup. We then had a series of what we call, this should be independent variables, not dependent variables. And the first set were what we call capabilities. So capabilities are the things that companies use to achieve competitive advantage. The first was international experience in emerging markets. The argument being that the more experience you have in emerging markets, the better your performance should be, right? Because the more time you spend in the marketplace, the more you should know about how to run your business. The second was a broader one called foreign market knowledge. So this is not just emerging markets, this is general international experience. Now what's interesting is we see, in fact, in our results, and we'll talk about this later on, is there's a distinct difference between having general experience of international business and having specific experience of doing business in developing countries. We find, in fact, that general experience does not necessarily improve a small company's performance in an emerging market. We can talk about why later on. The third capability is what we call managerial capabilities. So the idea here is if you have a bunch of well-educated MBAs from CEU Business School in your small company, you should, other things being equal, be a better company than if you didn't, right? And there's a lot of debate about how you would measure managerial capabilities. We used a fairly simple measure, which is the number of white-collar staff in the company. So the more white collars you have in your company, stylish ones because they're Italian, of course, the more successful you should be. And then the last capability, we looked at marketing capabilities. This is your ability to get your product into market, distributed, and sold. So it's a fairly broad definition of overall capacities. So again, think about it for a minute. The stronger your marketing capabilities, the more successful you should be in an international context, because these marketing capabilities help you to win new clients. Okay? So that's our first set of independent variables. our second set of what we call institutional voids. Remember, as I said to you right at the start of the presentation, institutional voids measure the lack of regulations, institutions that make markets function. Your markets don't exist by themselves. They exist because institutions support them. And we again chose a perceptual measure. We thought long and hard about this. We said, should we try and objectively measure institutional voids? And so we went to various World Bank indices and so forth. We came down to this fact that we think it's better to ask what the entrepreneurs think themselves about institutional voids. And we had a 7-scale measure relating to things like intellectual property rights, contract enforcement, corruption, and so forth. Yeah? So what did we find? The first thing we found in our linear regression model was the greater the marketing capabilities of an SME, the more success they have in emerging markets. We fully expected that. That's a basically straightforward conclusion. What we did find, which surprised us a little bit, is firstly, managerial capabilities and general international experience do not improve performance of small businesses in emerging markets. So of course, we got the results, we kind of scratched our heads for a little bit. Well, I don't have much hair to scratch, my kids have long hair. And they were scratching their hair while I was scratching my short hair, and we said, so why don't managerial capabilities matter? And we kind of coalesced around the idea that basically many of the skills that you learn in developed countries are not suitable for emerging markets, right? So you go to law school and you understand law. Well, yeah, in many places where there's no intellectual property law that's regularly enforced, it doesn't matter. Or you may understand accounting systems from developed countries, but trying to understand how accounting works in emerging markets is another thing entirely. So that was our first explanation. Question?
Well, going back to your definition of, or your measure of managerial capabilities was simply the number of white-collar workers.
Yeah.
I mean, did you go back and look at that, whether that was perhaps maybe not the most...
Well, by the number of white-collar workers, we were focusing... By white-collar worker,
they might not have had an MBA from CU Business School.
Sorry?
They might not have had an MBA from...
Well, certainly not, and that obviously held them back substantially. They didn't listen to presentations by me for a start. Actually, that maybe wouldn't hold them back. So by white collar, we talk about the years of education. So it's the number of years of post-secondary education defined as a white collar. So the more post-secondary education you have, the more white collar you are. So we think that in the measure of white collar, we are capturing educational level as a capability. The second thing we found is that general international experience does not improve the performance of small companies in emerging markets. Again, it's kind of logical actually. If most of our companies in our sample I'll ask you a question. These 200 SMEs, which countries do you think most of these Italian SMEs do their business in?
Russia.
Yeah, country.
EU. Developed countries, right? So fully 2/3 approximately of the sample do most of their business in a cluster of about 5 or 6 highly developed economies in Western Europe and North America. So again, much of the experience that these Italian firms have in developed countries, it has little or no value in emerging market contexts. Managing a supply chain, managing a retail outlet, branding and promotion. There's a company called Caligaris. Has anyone heard of Caligaris?
Yeah.
Right, do you have Caligaris?
If I have Caligaris?
Yeah, do you own any Caligaris?
No.
It's kind of expensive, and they do fancy furniture, right? So imagine, and they invest huge sums of money in showrooms. I mean, that's how they get people to buy. People walk into their showroom like, oh my God, if only I had a house that looked like this. Right? And so they buy the furniture. Now you go to a place like India, good luck trying to find high quality retail in many of India's largest cities that can reproduce the experience which is part of the sale. So I think we have credible explanations for why managerial capabilities and international experience don't count that much in emerging markets. Other two conclusions which I think are kind of interesting. One of our regression models, we directly measured the impact of institutional voids on company performance, and we found a statistically significant relationship between institutional voids and performance, which is the headline idea, right? The institutional voids lower the performance of small companies. If institutions are there, they perform better. And that's a very important finding, we think. And then what we did is we created what we call interaction variables. Interaction variables is where you draw two independent variables together and you measure their joint effect on the dependent variable, shortly speaking. And what we found here is that institutional voids not only lower overall performance, but they weaken the impact of marketing and managerial capabilities. In other words, a well-trained marketing manager working for an Italian company who does most of their business in France is going to be less capable when you send them to India or China. Which is an important finding for Italian companies, right? Because it begs important questions about their training and their preparedness to go abroad. Okay? So let me move on, because I've been talking for too long already, about implications and thoughts about our research. I think the first thing is that SMEs need to develop new resources and capabilities for coping with these institutional voids. So first of all, I think they need to think about networking capabilities. Right? And then there are two kinds of networking capabilities. One is forming alliances of Italian SMEs working together to conquer emerging markets, sharing resources, knowledge, experience, right? The second is to find local partners to build alliances with. Right? So then rather than going it alone, finding a local partner they can trust and building relational capabilities, that's what we call it in academic speak. I think they also have to take the risk of hiring local staff. Now, for small companies with revenues of 5 million euros, this is a big gamble, a big investment, right? But they need it. It's clear from our research that not having local staff lowers the performance of companies. And I think there are two more sets of implications. One for home governments, otherwise the Italian government. I think the Italian government needs to do a much better job of supporting their SMEs in emerging markets. Lobbying for reforms in the emerging markets, training staff for emerging market contexts, sending them to CU Business School, paying for it, more importantly. And the second thing I think is host governments. I think the pressure on host governments should be to sort of reform or develop institutions which are better suited to develop market economies. That's a much longer story and way beyond the scope of the paper, but that's pretty much what we discovered. So, got any questions or thoughts? Fire away. Yes?
Yeah. In the recent 3 years, I heard always that if you want to go to China, just hire local people because the only way to go there. So happy to see that finally scientifically it's proven. But have you ever considered doing the research in an opposite way? Finding out whether Chinese companies, when they go to the more advanced, like Western European market, whether these non-existing institutionalized voids help them to flourish here?
It's a very good research question.
Because it's...
yeah. What's your hunch?
My hunch is not. It's not. It's the same reason. Well, we was educated to do business in Western Europe, so we know the rules. And when we go to China, we don't know the rules, so we lack of the knowledge how to do business there.
And so you're saying when a Chinese company or an Indian company
come here, they don't know the rules. Same thing. Even though they have an there is no institute like voids, still don't know how to do the business.
So I'm thinking out loud here, so I have to warn you. Mind you, my MBA participants know I think out loud all the time, so they're used to it. So this is nothing new for them. I think there's an asymmetry, however. So I think that asymmetry is it's harder for a French manager to go to China and cope than it is for a Chinese manager to come to France and cope. I'm not talking on a cultural level, I'm talking on an institutional level, right? You can learn the institutions. It's much harder for you to understand tacit knowledge and informal practices. So that's an unscientific hunch, but that's how I think it would work. If you're thinking of doing a PhD, it's a great you should consider it. Any other questions or comments?
Well, I see a slight alternative. Rather than just give up and only employ Chinese people, just send all your interns. They've got the preconceptions already, and they'll find their own emergent way of doing business.
Probably would be more expensive.
Which should be cheaper.
Any other?
How do you find out in the first place if there's going to be a demand for your product, really?
Well, I think Italians, small Italian firms have what we call very low commitment modes of entry. Sorry, it's an academic speak. What does that mean? It means they tend to export. They don't invest abroad. Sometimes they'll sign contracts for distribution, but they tend to have a fairly arm's length approach. So they find out about market opportunities by going to trade fairs. They find out about market opportunities when a Chinese entrepreneur finds them. Let me tell you an anecdotal story. It's a lovely story. So in the northeast of Italy, there's a region called Friuli, and the wines in Friuli are not as famous as the wines from next door in Veneto or across the other side of the country in the Torino area or in Tuscany. And there was one Italian entrepreneur who had this very mid-priced wine you could buy it in a restaurant in Trieste or in Udine, the two main cities of the region, for maybe 20 euros a bottle, so it's not expensive wine. And at a trade fair, he met with a Chinese entrepreneur who wanted to sell Italian wines in China because, you know, with the emerging middle class in China, drinking wine is a sign of sophistication and development, and so forth. So they came up with a kind of wine, they called it Falcone d'Oro, which means the golden falcon. Right. And so the wine that they were selling in Italy for 20 euros a bottle, they can sell in upscale Chinese restaurants for 200 euros. Right? So that's a nice example of Italians leveraging marketing capabilities, right? But it came about because they were able to work with a local Chinese entrepreneur who could get them to the market, get them to the right places where their product could be showcased in the way it could.
Brings to mind the best business advice I ever got was if you're not sure how much to charge, just put that number that you're thinking of down the table and put a 1 in front of it. Because the worst that you can do is they'll turn it down, but if you get the deal, you're doing pretty
You'll
well.
laugh it all the way to the bank. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? One final thought. The next stage of the research after this is to examine this question of, over a period of time, given the performance that the Italian firms experience, do we see changes in their level of commitment to these markets? Right. So, for example, do we find that if they're not doing so well, that they actually reduce their effort? Or if they're doing well, by how much do they increase their efforts? For next year, you can ask me to come back in December and I can give
So
you
that's a deal.
Hey, I didn't sign a contract with you. Institutional voice. So that's our next research question. But you know, we think it's kind of interesting. We think there's not enough done on SMEs, and it's been interesting because you get to find out and work with some very interesting companies that do really cool things that you've never heard of before. Yeah.
Did you find any outliers? Did you see any people who figured out how to avoid this issue altogether?
This is regression research, so the granularity level is not there. When we get the distribution, we can then pull out outliers and we can explore them in detail. We haven't done that yet. I think that kind of research is better done on a case study basis. So we first of all identify the outlier, and then maybe we deep dive a little bit and write maybe case studies about particular companies. Yeah.
So the same thing would apply to Hungarian companies, small, mid-sized companies?
Well, I think the difference. Okay. So I'm talking in a knowledge vacuum, first of all. Right. So I'm not that familiar with Hungarian SMEs. My unscientific hunch would be that the level of marketing, the level of capabilities, perhaps with the exception of some tech firms, will not be as high as Italian firms. Just because Italian firms, they live and die by their marketing capabilities, their design capabilities, and so forth.
And does all this take very long to establish a market in China?
Well, our sample looked over a 3-year period, so we didn't, it's not a longitudinal study in that sense. I mean, that's a good research question. I think the second part of our research, which looks at escalation, how you increase your commitment, might actually